It's a pleasure to be invited here to speak. Thank you very much for extending the invitation to me. I would like to begin by giving you a little brief introduction to what the Institute for Figuring is and what is the kind of work that we do, because the specific talk that I'm going to give tonight, I think, really is situated for us within the context of a wider body of work and a whole sort of philosophical approach to what Christine and I believe that we're doing with the Institute for Figuring. And I think the whole framing is I suspect, of interest to you. The Institute for Figuring is an organization that my sister Christine Wertheim and I started in 2003. Christine, some of you may or may not know her. She teaches in the Department of Critical Studies at Cal Arts. She's currently the chair of the experimental writing program there. We are twins. When we finished high school, Christine went to art school and initially studied as a painter, and then ended up, through trying to address certain problems in her painting, ended up in her late 20s going back to school, going to university, and getting a PhD in the intersection of philosophy, language, and logic. Her own work is about trying to understand issues of what language can represent, what language can say, what language can do. And she is, in fact, the person who came to this project I'm going to talk about tonight, Dr. Shea Zellweger's logical alphabet, through, believe it or not, doing her PhD at the intersection of language and logic. So there's nothing about what I'm going to talk about today that in any way began as an art project, or was conceived as an art project, or was carried out as an art project. Everything that I'm going to talk about tonight was actually conceived from the point of view, and was pursued from the point of view of a deep and serious engagement with content, specifically in the contented areas of science, mathematics, and logic. I say that because it's very, very, I find it very bemusing and amusing that I'm so often, like you in this event tonight, invited to speak as a visiting artist, because I don't actually think of myself as an artist. My own background is in science and mathematics. When Christine went to art school after we left high school, I went to university and studied physics and mathematics, and I thought I was going to be a professional physicist. But after 6 years of an academic science education, I decided that what I wanted to do was be a science communicator rather than a professional working scientist. So my whole career has been as a public communicator about science and technology and mathematics. So I write books about the history of physics. I've done in the past a huge amount of journalism about science and technological subjects. And the Institute for Figuring was in large part conceived as an outgrowth of my desire to communicate to the public about science and mathematics. And I specifically felt at the time that we started it that what I wanted to do was to have some sort of a framework for introducing scientific, mathematical, technological ideas to people that would particularly be highlighting the aesthetic and poetic dimensions of the mathematical and scientific fields. So everything that the Institute for Figuring does comes from the perspective that what our primary motivation is doing is communicating and engaging people with scientific mathematical content. But obviously, there's a huge amount of scientific and mathematical content out in the world. How do you possibly decide which projects you're going to focus on? Well, Chrissy and I have, as it were, a philosophy about this, that what we're really both interested in, she coming from the position of being both an artist and then a trained philosopher and logician, and me coming from the position of being a scientist, what we both realized that we were incredibly interested in personally was the ways in which what's generally thought of as information that is conveyed through symbolic means could be represented, instantiated, and conveyed through material things. So the Institute for Figuring basically selects projects. I mean, there are many projects that we could do, but basically the philosophy of how we decide which projects we're going to do is that there is a huge amount of scientific and mathematical content to the work, but also there is, it's all things that can be instantiated physically and materially and engaged with through physical construction techniques. So one of the ways that we have thought about this is that in our society we have things called think tanks, and in think tanks great minds are employed to go and think great ideas and write books and write op-ed pieces and write articles. Chrissy and I believe that the world needs a similar thing. It needs play tanks. And we think of the Institute for Figuring as being a play tank. And we want it to be, as it were, an organization which gives people the experience of literally playing with ideas. And the ideas that we're specifically interested in playing with are generally, in our society, they're called things like logic, mathematics, and science. But one of the important things about the whole project is that it is meant to be experiential. We want through our work to give people the opportunity to literally experience ideas for themselves, and both as minds and as bodies. And so this is the home page of our website. We have a very extensive website, and the address of the organization is theiff.org. So there are many projects that we've done, and I hope some of you might be interested in going and seeing what other things we've done. I've passed out some handouts, which is our general brochure. There probably isn't enough for everybody. I wasn't sure how much of an audience I'd get, but all the information is anyway up on the website. What the Institute practically does, I've given you this sort of basic philosophical overview. What we practically do is we put on public lectures and public workshops. We do some small publications, and we also increasingly do exhibitions. Doing exhibitions was originally conceived as what we thought would be one part of what would, a smallish part of what we did. We thought we'd probably be doing mostly public lectures and small books. But in fact, doing exhibitions has turned out to be the biggest part of what we do, because some of the projects that we've done have been very much in demand. And the thing that we're most famous for, which I'm sure some of you know about, is this project called the Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef Project, which is currently on show at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. And I believe it's the first time ever that the National Museum of Natural History has had an art science show. The Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef Project has been shown all over the world, here in Los Angeles, in New York, London, Chicago, many, many places. For those of you who might be interested in seeing it, it is going to, after the Smithsonian, it's coming back to Los Angeles in a new incarnation, and it will be shown at Art Center's College of Design's gallery, the Williamson Gallery, up on the hill they have two galleries, but the Williamson Gallery is the one that's up on the hill where the main body of Art Center is. And the exhibition will open on June the 3rd and run through the summer. So for those of you who might want to see it, it is there. Mostly these days, I get a huge amount of invitations to speak about the Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef Project, and I talk about it all over the place. But given that you're design media arts students, I thought that it would be nice perhaps that you would like to see something that had potentially a link with electricity. Let me put it that way. Actually, you know, it's interesting because people say media arts, and we immediately think it should have electricity going through, but is that true? I get the feeling that the electricity is probably a fairly important thing around here. So I thought that I would talk about a project that does potentially involve electricity, which the Crochet Coral Reef project doesn't. Okay, so I'm going to begin my presentation about tonight's specific topic. Let me get out of there. Now, all of you should have, or many, hopefully they haven't run out, a little handout about the subject tonight. There's no necessity for you to be reading that while I'm giving the talk. It's really a little gift that is for those of you who would like to go home and think about what we talk about tonight. You can, it's a little brochure that we made that explains in some more depth. The work that I'm talking about tonight has been produced by a man called Dr. Shea Zellweger. I should say it is currently on exhibition at the Museum of Jurassic Technology. Have any of you actually seen it? A couple of you. It is only on for a very short time. It's actually been, the exhibition's actually been up for 3 years, 4 years, 3 or 4 years. It will be coming down very, very soon. If you would, I urge you who are interested to go and see it while you can, because it may never be on show ever again. We will do everything we can to hopefully ensure that it will get shown again. But a project like this is not a project that an art gallery or museum would normally show. So this kind of work, it's pretty radical to get it exhibited at all. So the work, it's a body of work produced by a man called Dr. Shea Zellweger, who is now at the end of his life. He's in his about 85 now. And he produced this body of work largely between from about 1953 through the 1970s. Although he continues to work on it now. He's been working at it now for almost 60 years. Dr. Zellweger, he's doctor because he's actually he was a professor of psychology at Mount Holyoke University in Illinois. He's now retired, obviously. But this work that I'm showing you has nothing to do with his professional life whatsoever. He had a job as a professor of psychology, but this is his life's project, and it's completely what has driven him for, as I say, close to 60 years. So he came to this work in the 1950s. And what it actually is a way of representing logic, the logic that computers run on. Now, some of you will know a great deal about logic. Some of you build logic circuits. And what Shea Zellweger has come to is he made a mathematical discovery in the 1950s that underlying the symbolic logic on which computers operate, there is a geometric structure called a symmetry group. And this is a three-dimensional model that he built, which is a physical material instantiation of this symmetry group. And in fact, it's a discovery, unbeknownst to him at the time, that had been made by 5 mathematicians throughout history. So a number of the great mathematicians who were involved in developing modern logic in the late 19th century, Charles Sanders Peirce is one of them, actually had made this discovery that Dr. Zellweger made. But he didn't know that. He made it independently for himself. And that often happens in the history of mathematics, that that numbers of people make discoveries. But he came to this as he wasn't trained as a mathematician, he wasn't trained as a logician. he had some kind of epiphany in a hospital. He was recovering from injuries he'd sustained due to World War II, and he had this epiphany, and he saw this structure in some way. And he spent his life, as it were, literally playing with the repercussions of this idea. So he's done this huge body of work looking at the visuality of the set of relations underlying logic, and exploring ways in which they can be visually represented, which is it's a direct analogue of the mathematics. And I just want to show you some of his, before we get into what this is, I just want to give you some sense of the beautiful visual appeal of what he's done. He has thousands of pages of notebooks. He's between 1953 and 1975. He filled these huge notebooks. They're about this big, and he's got a whole rack of them that are kept in his garage. And there's thousands and thousands of pages of this. We'll get to a lot more of them later. But what all of them are is that they're not produced as artworks. They're produced to be representational tools of the mathematical structure that logic is allied with. And he believes that one of the reasons he spent so much time on this is because he believes that the visual tools that he's worked out, both the two-dimensional and three-dimensional tools, should actually be used to teach logic. And some of you will know, hands up actually, how many people in this room have formally studied logic? Oh, really? I'm surprised there's not more. Learning logic is normally done in mathematics departments or computer science departments. I learned logic in the mathematics department when I was at university. It's hard. It's a symbolic language that's not, it's a branch of mathematics. And it's actually quite hard to learn logic. It doesn't sort of seem obvious when you're learning. I mean, even for mathematicians, it's a little bit bamboozling when you first come to it. But logic so it's usually represented as a formal, written down, symbolic language. And that's the way computer scientists use it, and people who are developing all kinds of, not programmers, but people who are trying to understand what is logically possible with computers do actually formally write logic equations down, and they look like mathematical equations of a particular kind, and it is a language. And it's hard, and you don't get to learn it until you're at college or university. So one of Shea's interests is that he believes that this incredibly important field of study can be taught to little children, and that it can be taught through visual representations, and by literally visually drawing these diagrams and also playing with these physical models. And we'll see some more of the physical models as he's developed a bit later. So what he actually wants to achieve is a revolution in computing. Well, it's two revolutions. He wants to have a pedagogical revolution in which he literally believes that primary school children, kids of 5 or 6 or 7, could be taught logic through playing with these visual relationships that would then enable them later on to move to the symbolic. But his claim, and I actually think he's correct, is that using his tools, this very difficult set of ideas could be, I believe, be conveyed to children, and literally then ultimately, to everybody, that there's no reason, Shea thinks, why all of us shouldn't have access to this. It's just the way it's been so far represented as a purely symbolic thing, and Shea's claim is that that's not necessary, and the proof that it's not necessary is his work, is his life work. So he does have a pedagogical aim, but he also has another aim, which is to revolutionize computing itself. And we'll get into that claim a bit further down the track, but hold this thought in your mind, that what is potentially at stake here is how computers are actually instantiated. And Shea is right that if his system was adopted, we could have a completely different way of doing computing. He's actually technically right about that. The question, and his claim is that if we use the totality of his system and we instantiated computers on it in this way, it would make computing a lot more efficient and a lot better. Now, the interesting thing about this claim is not whether it's true or not. The claim's correct. The question is it ever likely to happen? And my own personal view is that it isn't going to happen, but it isn't. But the claim itself is perfectly valid and legitimate, and we'll get into the details of it. So he actually does want to create a genuine change in the way that our technology is instantiated across the entirety of all modern computers. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking to you about what logic is. And so I have to ask you a question. Would you actually like to have an understanding about how computers operate with logic? We'll try to do this because I'd like you to have an appreciation, if possible, of the incredible power of what this actually represents. Computers operate, as I'm sure you all know, through bits of information. So computers, stabilize this a bit. Computers operate by sending bits of information. And so this is a 0, and these represent 1s. So that's a 0, and then this would be a 1, 1, and 0. So that bit stream is 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0. And that's all computers send. They've got two things they can do. It can be on or off. It can be 1 or a 0. It doesn't seem like a very promising way to do complex things. But in fact, we have learned to do incredibly complex things just with 0s and 1s. And does anyone know, by the way, who was the first person who proposed that you could have a universal language of conveying all kinds of information in 0s and 1s? Who? Yeah? Very good. Did everyone hear? Do you want to tell? Leibniz, the great 17th century mathematician, scientist and philosopher Leibniz, who was a contemporary of Newton's and co-discoverer of calculus. So computers send 0s and 1s. The circuit is either on or off. How do you do anything with that? Well, the way that computers work is that they have what's called logic gates, which called logic gates. And basically they take the 0s and 1s. So if we have two inputs, A and B, and we say, what happens when I put these two inputs together? So A is doing something and B is doing something. Right. So computer logic gates take in two signals and they give one output. So you have, this is where we represent a logic gate. You have an A input and a B input, and you get some output. And so all computers are built like this. And so the question is, what happens when I get a certain input from A and B, and I can get different kinds of outputs. This is all that modern computers do. And they have huge, vast arrays of these these logic gates that are all combined, and this is what transistors are made up from. And ultimately, you get out the end, ultimately after this huge process of going through 1 million logic gates, you get out the end, your output stream, which is, meet me at the Starbucks at 3. But this huge amount of circuitry has gone into achieving that, and somehow the circuits have to go from zeros and ones to something else. Well, the output is zeros and ones too. So there are all sorts of ways in which A and B could be potentially, that the inputs from A and B could potentially lead to an output. And this is what modern logic is about. Or at least modern logic. I should say modern logic actually came out of trying to understand what language could represent. So logic, emerged from originating with the ancient Greeks, understanding is, if I say all cats, if I say cats are black, this animal is a cat. Is it a cat, or is it, could it be something else? So logic evolved traditionally by trying to understand what it was that language could represent. And in the 19th century, the late 19th century, that got codified into a very specific set of rules, which we now know as modern logic. And it's those particular rules which were a very, very formalized, mathematicalized conception of what language can represent that gets instantiated in computers. So what happens with computers is that if we have our two inputs, A and B, A can be either 0 or 1. B can be either 0 or 1. So we have if we look at A and we look at B, A can be well, I'm going to make a slight shift here. 0 and 1 can also be represented, as they were traditionally in logic, as either false or true. So that's, either the statement is not happening, so it's false and it's 0, or it is happening and it's true, and that's represented by a 1. So I'm going to shift to using the T and F rather than the 0 and 1, because this is how it's represented in formal logic. So A can be either on or off, 0 or 1, which is either false or true. And B could, I'm just going to get my chart because I don't want to do this off the top of my head and get it wrong for you. Each of them can either be on or off, true or false, there are 4 combinations. Either A can be off and B can be off. Either A can be off and B can be on, or A can be on and B can be off, or A can be on and B can be on. So do you all understand that? Does that make sense? What I'm doing here is drawing what's called a logic truth table. And this is the heart of Dr. Zellweger's discovery. This is called a truth table. So there are always four combinations of either they're both off, they're both on, or one is off and one's on, or the other's off and the other's on. Okay? Now, so there's 4 possibilities of what the input set could be. So does anyone want to guess how many options there are for an output set? Sorry? Did someone say? Someone said an answer that I think was correct. Okay. Someone? 16. Yes. The number of possible output combinations is 2 to the power of 4, 16. And I'm going to represent one of them for you. So in logic, there is a function called AND. If A is on and B is on, this is what we call an AND gate, then the output is true. So I'm going to draw this for you here. If we've got our input is A and B, and we only want the output to be true or on when both of them are true. So the truth table for that is if A is off and B is off, well, obviously they're not both on, so the answer is off. If one of them is on, then still it's not true that both of them are on. It's only true, the function AND is only true when both of them are on. A is on and B is on. Right? So this means that in response to these inputs, this output will only be on when both of them are on. Does that seem clear to you? Please say if this isn't. Now, it turns out that there are 16 possible output sets. One of them is called the AND function. One of them is called the OR function. A is on or B is on. So A is true or B is true. Does anyone want to guess bravely what the truth, if we had OR, what would be? If it's an OR function, what would this element be? Do you want to guess? Sorry? False, good. And what would, sorry? And what would this one be? And what would this one be? And what would this one be? Very good. Okay. Good question. Good question here. Is this one on or off? Some people think on and some people think off. If it's a normal OR gate, it is in fact on because A is on or B is on. But there happens to be another possibility, which is where this one is off. And what that is called is it's called an exclusive OR. You know, it's only true when A is on or B is on, but not both of them. So it's an exclusive OR function. So you begin to get to see that there are different output sets based on these inputs. And it turns out there is only 16 possible output sets, 16 possible things. And modern logic, and I've shown you a couple of the easy ones like AND, OR, and even exclusive OR. They are the ones that I've just told you, can be easily described in verbal language. Our language has the words AND. Our language has the word OR. It's not hard for us to describe the concept of an exclusive OR. Some of the other ones, some of the other 16 set, are very difficult to describe in natural language. They all can be described in natural language, but some of them are very, very convoluted. And they're not readily a part of our language structure, and nor are they readily a part, therefore, of how we normally, or how we have come to think. And it turns out that in modern computing, there's really only 5 or 6 of them that are actually used. In computing, so these logic circuits simply represent these 16 possible functions. And there's AND, OR, exclusive OR, and there's a couple of others. And there's really only, you can actually build a computer. You can actually build an entire computer using only one of these. But usually in computers, they are built from about 4 or 5 of them. I think 5 is the most common number. And this is what you actually have to do in the silicon. So basically, modern logic and modern computing is really built around a subset of the possibilities. And it's a subset of really about 5 or 6 of them. But there is a whole existing set of 16. They're called connectives, is the term of them. In logic, they're called connectives. And so what Shea Zellweger's work is about is the essence of it is actually saying all 16 of them matter equally. All 16 of them have just as much power and legitimacy as logical relationships. They're all equally valid. As logical relationships, which is part of mathematics, they're all equally valid. Why do we only privilege the 5 of them? And the reason that we do is because they're the ones that, as I said before, are easily incorporated into natural language and which have therefore grown up through, the history of, emerging from Aristotelian logic and syllogisms. And when logic got codified in the late 19th century in its modern form, only those 5 were really used. But Shea's point is that all 16 of them are available to us. Why don't we use all 16 of them? And what he has done is actually all of his work is a playing out of how all 16 of them can be represented as parts of a total visual system. Now, this is a lovely diagram of Shea's that, see, he's representing the truth tables here on his fingers. And this is actually the 16 truth tables. I did one there. So each of these there are 16 of them, and he's represented them all here. But what is important about this diagram up there is that one of his beginning exercises is that you can put the truths and false on your fingers and begin to actually do truth tables playing with your fingers. So that's one of his concrete visual tools. You can literally do truth tables with your fingers. But that's just a starting point. So here we have the truth table for A and B. This is our A-B truth table. But what he has said is one of the things you can do with this is to represent them by a square. So you can see if we have the A axis and the B axis, and we've got the 4 possibilities. Both of them are true. A is true and B is false. They're both false. A is false and B is true. And so do you see why there's a dot in the right-hand corner? Because it's true. And there's no dots anywhere else. And one of Shea's tools that he's developed is to say that all of these 16 connectives could be represented with this little square and a dot in either 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 places. And then he's made a further step is to say you can he's associated each of these square diagrams with a letter. Some of the letters are real letters of the alphabet or normal letters of the alphabet. Others are slightly made up. So this is the AND function. And you can see that's just showing how we get it. But he's got letters. These are all the 16 connectives. And D represents the AND. But there are letters representing each one of the connectives. So I forget off the top of my head which one that represents. But this is one where okay, so this is true, but you see, actually I think that one there shouldn't be a dot up in that corner actually, that's just a mistake of the diagram. But see, if there wasn't a dot, the dot should only be where the truths are, but you can see how that's a H. Can you all see that can be represented by a H? And what he's done is to take all of the 16 connectives and develop a letter for each of them. And as I say, or to associate each one of them with a letter. And he calls this the logic alphabet. And this is his logic alphabet. Now you see some of the letters are not, usual letters in our alphabet. But you get the inherent logic of the system makes incredible logical sense. And one of the things, if you begin to study this, you will notice that they come in groups and they're symmetrical. So for each one of these P-like symbols, there is its mirror opposite, and its mirror opposite in the X direction, the mirror opposite in the Y direction. And you see the same is true for these H symbols. There's the H upside down H and an upside down H and a mirror flipped upside H and upside down H. So you can immediately begin to see that this is it's a visual alphabet, but it also has in its, literally in the structure of the letters, there's representations of certain kinds of symmetries. And these symmetries are actually what are represented. Oh, and he has this, this is an object, it's about that long, it's an incredibly beautiful object made out of wood with the hand lettering, and it's painted these sort of Russian constructivist colors. This is on display, all of these models are on display at the Museum of Jurassic Technology. And he calls this his flipstick, and one of the words he uses is flipstick logic. So this is a representation of all of the 16 connectives, each one showing its dot arrangement. And so you can see each letter, like this one is connected, is the C, because these two dots are on. This, you can see immediately the, as it were, inherent symmetries in this representational version. This is a two-dimensional representation, and then you can see it's arranged with visual symmetry guiding it. It's not an arbitrary thing. It's not an aesthetic decision here. It necessitates itself to be arranged this way. But you're beginning to get a sense that there is, in fact, visual symmetry embedded in what is normally thought of as a purely symbolic system. Shea has endless pages of the implications of a system. To be frank about it, I don't know specifically what this page represents. There are thousands and thousands of pages of this. But what I want to move on to is the fact that as well as using the letters, this logic alphabet that he's developed, you can, and we've seen the visual symmetries that are embedded in that, as it were, language representation. And that is because it turns out that there is a geometric structure that is the direct analog of these 16 relationships. And it's called a symmetry group. Symmetry groups are a huge, huge part of mathematics that are immensely important in many fields. Symmetry groups, for instance, underlie theoretical physicists' understanding of the subatomic particles. Traditionally, where mathematicians discovered symmetry groups was in the study, literally, of the symmetry of crystals. All crystals in nature have a certain symmetry properties, and it turns out there's only so many crystalline symmetries in nature. But in nature, there's a limited set of crystalline symmetries which are embedded in gemstones. But it turns out that this whole subject of symmetry groups turns out to be much, much vaster than what's embodied in crystals. And there's this massive study of symmetry groups by mathematicians for the last 150 years. And one particular symmetry group is actually exactly the same mathematical structure that underlies these logical relationships. And so what Shea's life work has been about is representing the visual symmetries and subsymmetries of this wider group, of this group. Now, there's no way that I can explain, or probably anybody but Shea could really know what many of these diagrams represent. It would take somebody, working at his work for years, probably doing a PhD thesis, to know exactly what a diagram like that represents. But all of this is meant to be, not meant to be, it is playings out of the mathematical properties of this particular set of relationships. And Shea has been doing really essentially what this is a research project in logic in which he has shown a whole lot of the truths that mathematicians have discovered for themselves through the symbolic techniques, but he has taught himself this through this visual language. And as I said earlier, the reason that he wants the world to pay attention to this is because he believes that if the world paid attention to this, all children, and therefore all people, could ultimately understand logic, but the implications would ultimately be that we would build computers by instantiating in the silicon not just a couple of these connectives, but all 16 of them. So instead of just building computers from AND gates and OR gates and NOT gates, we would actually build all 16 relationships in silicon hardware. And Shea's claim is that if we did that, it would revolutionize the way we do computing, because our thinking and our playing out of computing wouldn't just be based on this subset, but we would have access mentally to all 16 of them. And as I said to you earlier, these our natural language has words for the obvious ones like and, or what we think of the obvious ones as and or. We don't have words for most of the others, but Shea is giving us lettering for them. And he actually has names. Each of these 16 connectives has a name in his system. And so his belief is that if we were all trained this as 5 or 6 year olds, our brains would actually, as it were, be able to rewire so that we could, in fact, treat this like a language, that we did have access to all 16 of them. And I believe he's completely right about that. I mean, it would just be like any other language. You know, we can learn ancient Chinese, we can learn Sanskrit. Why couldn't we learn this language? We could. The question is, are we going to? Is our society going to take up this proposal? Shea has lived his life for 60 years, for the last 60 years, he's now about 85, hoping that the world would pay attention, hoping that the world would take up the project. The world is showing no sign of doing so, and if I was asked to predict, my prediction would be that the world is never going to. But he is right. If we did learn this all very young, we would have access to this in our mental space. We could instantiate it in computers. It would speed up computers. He's correct about that. But there's trillions and trillions of dollars worth of computers that exist in the current mode. And it's a bit like Betamax and VHS. Everybody agrees that Betamax was a better technology. But it didn't take off because once VHS was really instantiated, the world wasn't going to give up all the VHS players and go to a new instantiation. And I think a similar thing applies here. The world isn't going to just suddenly abandon all of its technology that it's been developing for 100 years and go to another technology. I've just got a few minutes left, and what I wanted to show you in this is, I said that there is a geometric structure underlying underlying logic, and it's a geometric structure called a symmetry group that has 16 points. That group, and this is one representation of it. This is actually a drawing of it. Does anyone recognize what that is a representation of? Yes, who said that? Very good. Do you want to explain to everyone what a hypercube is? Yeah. Yes, I'll just paraphrase. It's a four-dimensional version of a cube. So this is a cube, which is a three-dimensional, it's a three cube. So imagine that each one of those points was connected, as it were, to another dimension. Like this, as this man rightly said, a square is a two-dimension. I'm just going to draw it because a square is a two-dimensional structure that has certain symmetry properties. When I make into a three-dimensional version, what I get is a cube. And although I can't draw it very well, if I make the same move into the next dimension, I get what's called a hypercube, which is basically it's just a four-dimensional version of a cube. Now, this is one way of trying to represent a four-dimensional cube. And the hypercube is actually, it's an interesting object, and you can you see that it has 16 points to it. So a square has 4 points, which is 2 to the 2. A cube has 8 points, which is 2 to the cube. And a hypercube has 2 to the 4, which is equal to 16 points. So the 16 points of the hypercube map to the 16 letters of the logic alphabet. So this geometric structure is a direct analogy. Not an analogy, it's a direct, it's not an analogy, it's a mapping to these 16 connectives of the total set of logic. And that kind of cross-referencing of different areas of mathematics between something like geometry and logic is one of the great revelations of the past 100 years of mathematics, that in fact over the past 100 years mathematicians have repeatedly discovered that things that appear to be purely symbolic actually do have geometric analogues. And this actually remains one of the great mysteries in mathematics. Why is this so? And what does it mean in some broad philosophical sense? And these are still open questions. Does anyone know? There's very famous artwork which has the hypercube represented in it. Does anyone know what it is? Salvador Dali has a famous painting of Christ crucified on a cross, which is a representation of a hypercube. I don't remember off the top of my head what it's called, but I'm sure you've all seen it. So here it is. This is the hypercube. That's the drawing of it. And here's the physical thing that Shea built. And this is basically all of the physical models that Shea has made of these logic play toys. And it's these models which are on show at the Museum of Jurassic Technology. I mean, that's not a picture from the Museum of Jurassic Technology. This, I believe, that at some point they were displayed in his department at Mount Holyoke College, I believe, is where this photograph comes from. But you can see this is his logic flipstick. Here's his tesseract, his hypercube. And these are all very, see, these, you can see these are like, this is actually, as it were, a block toy for literally doing logic yourself, for making little and or relationships and seeing what happens. And he has all of these wonderful things, and he's got lovely names for them, like the logic bug and the clock compass and flipstick logic. So the whole thing, it's incredibly playful, and he did these, he made these in the late 1970s because he really did want to show the world that this could be, as it were, a powerful pedagogical tool for potentially children to use. So he hasn't just, as it were, presented this as a possibility. He's actually made them. He's given us a whole pedagogical system. Nobody's ever taken these up, and the only ones of these that exist are the ones that he himself made. And for most of the past 30 or 40 years, all of this has simply sat in a basement, sat in Shea's basement in boxes. And the Museum of Jurassic Technology was, when we presented it to them as an idea for showing it, we were absolutely thrilled that they did. And we were rather surprised, actually. No one else has ever shown any interest in showing it. And I should say, Christine was the one who came to Shea, and it's an interesting story how she did come to it. She was doing her PhD in London at the time in language and logic, and she was interested in the work of the great American mathematician, logician Charles Sanders Peirce, and she had a semester doing research in the Peirce archives in Texas, and they had some of Shea's papers on file because Peirce is one of the people who had made this discovery himself, and Shea, in his attempts to reach out to the mathematic and scientific community, had contacted the people at the Peirce archives, and they had shown at least some interest, not in necessarily going into his system, but at least in housing some of his papers, because he had made the same discovery that Peirce had made. But as I say, that is the only time he's really had much in the way of academic interest in his work. But I'll just end on showing you this, this table. What this represents is the different ways in which this set of relations can be represented. So here's the truth tables. Here's how you would represent each of the connectives in language. So as we said, we have simple ones like A and B, or not A, not B. But each one of them can be represented in language. But you see some of them are really rather quite complicated. This version here, on this middle column, that is how one of the ways in which, when you study logic at university, that it's written down in these forms. This is Peirce's logic alphabet. This is a version that was elaborated by a mathematician called McCulloch in the 1930s, who's also an important person in the history of computing. And this is a system by a Polish mathematician. And I show that to you simply by way of saying that Shea did make a discovery that other people had made before him. All of the other people had been great mathematicians. Each of them developed their own visual notation system. I particularly like McCulloch's one. But none of them, they stopped there. They just said, okay, that's it. We've done this. We could have this, we have this other notation, but they didn't really do anything else with it. What Shea has done has spent his life articulating it in a whole beautiful body of work. And I'll just end by showing you a couple. As I say, there's thousands and thousands of pages. There was one diagram that I was hoping to get to. Here, this one. I don't personally know what this diagram means. But, I mean, I do know what it's representing in some way, and how it does this is something I'm trying to find out. But this is one of Shea's diagrams of this system, and it is also a diagram of a fantastic geometrical object called the projective plane. And there is apparently a true mathematical relationship between this symmetry group and the projective plane. I don't quite understand what it is, and I'm trying to find a mathematician who can tell me. But this is a man who, he had no training in mathematics. He had an epiphany from his hospital bed, and this is what he's done. And whatever else you can say about it, to me, this is an extraordinary aesthetic project. It may or may not ever revolutionize the way we do computing, but I find it staggeringly inspiring as a way to spend one's life. We'll take some questions. Yes.
Hold on, I'm going to hand over the microphone so people online can hear you.
Do you think this advanced the theory that logic is the foundation of mathematics?
Sorry, I couldn't quite hear your question.
Do you think this advanced the theory that logic is the foundation of mathematics?
I don't think I quite comprehend what it. Yeah, I don't think I quite comprehend your question. Can you say it in a slightly different way?
Frege, Russell,
Frege,
and
right.
Whitehead
Yes.
believed that logic was the foundation of mathematics.
Yes.
Do you think this theory advanced?
Oh, this is a very sophisticated question. The gentleman is saying that the mathematician Frege and mathematician Whitehead and Russell thought that logic was the foundation of all mathematics. And the question that he's asking is, do I think that Shea's theory supports that or suggests that it is or it isn't? You know, to be really honest, I don't know. I hadn't actually thought about that. The question of, is logic the foundation of all mathematics? I am not actually sure how many mathematicians still believe that. My guess is that a lot do, but that there would definitively be some people who didn't. But I don't actually know do you know?
No, I don't know.
I mean, it's a question that's been debated for a long time, and I'm not sure what most.
I never heard it been resolved, so that's why.
Yes.
One more question. Do you think this point towards some subatomic structure in the universe, perhaps?
So the question is, does this point towards some subatomic structure in the universe? I don't know that it does, and Shea doesn't think of it that way. But the question is an important one, because there is a history of thinking that there is a mathematical structure underlying the human mind. And Charles Sanders Peirce was one of the first people who proposed that idea. And Lacan was one of the people who took up that idea. And so there is a tradition of thinking that says that there is literally a mathematical structure underlying our thinking. And according to Peirce, the structure that underlies the human mind is the projective plane. And so if that is so, then this work of Shea's is actually fundamentally allied with not the structure of the physical universe, but with the structure of our mental universe. And I think it's an absolutely fabulous thought, that thought itself might have some crystallographic structure. And Shea believes that. There is, by the way, a body of anthropology that also holds this view. It's not mainstream. I mean, it's a very small group of anthropologists, but there's a number of people who've had this thought. Peter?
Yeah, I saw this show at the Museum of Jurassic Technology, and I puzzled through it for close to an hour, and I have to say that I needed this experience to come to an appreciation for it. My appreciation sort of stopped at the level, at that point, stopped at the level of what you could almost call minor knowledge. Mm-hmm. That, in other words, there's something about a figure like this doctor who creates an alternate form of knowledge that doesn't make it into the mainstream. Mm-hmm. And that when that knowledge finds a compelling aesthetics as well, it can become this wonderful, almost wormhole. Mm. And I get, and that's sort of this statement. My question about the IFF and what you're doing is, it strikes me as being remarkably linked to Los Angeles and the development of a kind of set of organizations that have all come up in the last 20 years, right? Yeah. And I'm thinking about, obviously, the Museum of Jurassic Technology, the Center for Land Use Interpretation, the IFF, that they're all, in a very interesting way, trying to expand these kind of minor knowledge bases to become their own schools. And I wonder if you and Christine talk about that or think about that, or is that just asking about fish and water?
Well, I'm delighted, Peter, that you asked that question, because not many people see that connection, but it's completely true.
Two gates.
Two gates, exactly. A D. You get a D, Peter. And in this case, a D is a good thing.
All right.
Yes, you're completely right. We're very good friends with David Wilson, who runs the Museum of Jurassic Technology, and with Matt Coolidge, who runs the Center for Land Use. We were definitively inspired by their example, and Chrissy in fact coined a fabulous term for this, which a few people are beginning to pick up on, called feral institutions. Mm. And we are definitively, Chrissy and I talk about it a great deal, and Matt and David don't talk about it overtly in public, but it is of great interest to them.
David never talks about anything overtly, ever.
That's true. But we are all allied in our view that the world needs new organizations of information. We're all allied in that none of us see ourselves as artists. We all see, for the purposes of grants, applications, we call ourselves artists. But none of us self-identify in that way. We all see ourselves as engaging with knowledge, and we all committed very strongly in our own ways to the notion that the world needs new institutions of knowledge, new ways of engaging with knowledge, of representing it. And we are all bound by another thing, which I'd like to publicly acknowledge, which is that at this point in time, none of us would be able to have existed for the last few years without the generous support of one particular person. Lauren Bond, who's one of the trustees of the Annenberg Foundation, has supported us all over the past 5 years. Not exclusively, but all of us have got a substantial proportion of our funds, and in some years our only funds, because she saw the value of what we were doing. And in fact, collectively, we actually are an association. It's called the Association of Marginal Institutions, which is a beautiful term that Lauren came up with. But I say this publicly for two reasons. One is to acknowledge Lauren's vision and generosity in supporting us, but also to say publicly a thing that is necessary, given that you raise these other institutions as well. It's almost impossible to get this work funded. And we were lucky that a right person came along. If she hadn't come along, it's entirely possible that all of us would have collapsed. Oh, Ido first, and then this man over here.
Yeah, I don't really know. I haven't actually thought about this much before, but I was just thinking, what do you think about kind of the parallels between like the limits of Euclidean geometry, or let's say Euclidean geometry versus what we can imagine as non-Euclidean geometry, you know, extra dimensions, and the limits of language sort of bound to a binary logic system. Do you see a parallel there? Kind of like looking at a priori ways in which we're able to kind of think beyond our instinct or something?
Well, I think the question that you're asking, Ido, is...
Not quite sure what the question is.
I think what the question you're really asking is, you know, we have a version of geometry that we all learn at school, Euclidean geometry. Sorry, have I been covering my microphone? We all learn Euclidean geometry at school, or at least some of it. Or do we all still learn Euclidean geometry at school? I don't know. I hope they do. And so Ido's question is really, you know, we now know that there are other kinds of geometries. And so, as it were, our minds have been expanded about the possibilities. And so the question is this an analog? And it is, yes. I mean, and that is something that the history of mathematics is about mind expanding. You know, mathematics began with very simple things. Basically, the two primary things that mathematics begins with is the concept of quantity, which is numbers, 1, 2, 3. You know, I have 3 sheep in my paddock. I have 4 coins in my purse. And the other thing that, and from numbers, then you expand out to the whole world of algebra and ultimately incredible things like, you know, Lie groups and symmetry groups. And the other thing that mathematics begins with is the study of form, which is geometry. So basically the study of quantity and form give rise to vast areas of mathematics. And the history of one way that I read the history of mathematics anyway, is to say that it's really a gradual sequence of people realizing that the rules that seem to be applying to the concrete material things actually are just one set of possibilities, that there are more possibilities in, as it were, that the system has lots more possibilities than are immediately obvious from the things in front of us. And I'll just give you a very easy example of this. Counting, the numbers begin from saying I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chairs. Then there was a realization at some point in the history that, well, I don't have to just restrict myself to whole numbers. I can have fractional numbers. So you can have the concept of 3 1/4. There's 3 1/4 chairs. 3 1/4 chairs doesn't make much sense, but 3 1/4 of a lot of things does make sense. So, and then there was a realization, well, we've got the numbers that go in this direction. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the quarters. Then there was a realization, well, what happens between the fractions? Like what happens between 3, you know, 1/3 and 1/2? And there was a realization that there could be a continuous sequence of numbers, so you get the idea of what's called the irrational numbers, which were called irrational because they couldn't be reduced to a fraction. They were literally not rational. The word rational derives, I don't know if any of you know this, but the word rational literally derives from mathematics. Rational comes from the word ratio, and a ratio is thing that can be represented A over B. So if that's what a fraction is. And if something cannot be represented by a ratio of A over B, then it's called irrational, and numbers like pi, you all know pi, is an irrational number. And this was a huge problem for the ancient Greeks who discovered irrational numbers, the Pythagoreans, because they were really troubled by what could that sort of a number mean. And then later on, Indian mathematicians discovered another number that the Western world rejected for 1,500 years. Anyone want to guess what that number is? Sorry? 0, yeah. Greek mathematicians completely rejected the idea of 0. It comes to us via India. And the Indians have a long tradition of thinking about, philosophical thinking about the void. And it's been argued by some historians of mathematics that because they had this big, rich tradition of philosophical thinking about the void, they could accept the idea of signifying nothing, which is what 0 is. But Western mathematicians rejected the signification of nothing because it didn't seem to make sense. How could nothing be represented? Because it would seem to be saying it's at one time a nothing and a something. And so this is by way of saying the history of mathematics has been a gradual opening up of realizing that just because what's in front of us isn't the only possibilities. And the same thing has happened in the realm of geometry, and indeed I believe in all of mathematics.
I guess the other part of the question was just the analogy between language as being...
Oh, Rita, can you...
Sorry. The analogy of language being reduced to these true-false statements that we can stack together to get to more complexity, and some limit, let's say, in representing or imagining just 3 dimensions. You know, that there's some kind of connection in that way. That when it goes past some kind of physical limit on dimensionality, you know, we can sculpt in 3D space. So we can get to that 3 and then it stops. And if we go beyond that, we have to start thinking abstractly. And I don't know, it just seems, you know, just the question of these kind of, some kind of a priori physical limit on how we, you know, materialize things versus where we go beyond when we think about them.
Well, obviously we live in... I can't make the following statement. I was going to say, obviously we live in 3-dimensional space, but I can't say that statement because I don't believe it. Obvious, 3 dimensions is a special dimensionality. 3 dimensions has real physical properties that we do have access to physically. And in fact, physicists have shown that 3 dimensions is special physically. Like, it's very difficult to have a force of gravity in 4 dimensions. Gravity doesn't really, 1 on r squared force, doesn't actually work in higher dimensions. It certainly doesn't work in 4 dimensions. There are versions of it you can get to work in higher dimensions, but not 4. But 3-dimensionality is actually physically special. But and so we do things in 3 dimensions that we can't do in other dimensions. But we can think high dimensionally, and in all sorts of scientific, not just mathematicians and physicists, but almost all the sciences now use higher dimensional mathematics in modeling all sorts of things. Medicine, for instance, has this huge reliance now on multi-dimensional spaces. They're often called parameter spaces or phase spaces. And basically, all of these many sciences use these high-dimensional parameter spaces, which are just multi-dimensional versions of Euclidean space, to help them search for all kinds of solutions to all kinds of problems, like finding pharmaceuticals, like finding clusters of syndromes that relate to a particular medical condition. So this high-dimensional mathematics, believe it or not, has now become one of the most important tools in the totality of science today. So we do, in fact, use these things. But I'm not sure if that really answers your question. This gentleman over here, you got, man. Yes?
Art in our history, human history, but especially in Western history, always had a mathematical focus in aesthetic. We can look at the canons of proportion in classical Greek sculpture, or we can look at, excuse me, I don't know why it lets me. But anyway, I'm wondering, usually with the, like the golden ratio in two-dimensional graphic design, but usually that kind of mathematics was under the hood, so to speak. Here, if I may make this interpretation, the hood's kind of taken off and we're invited to play with the engine a little bit to learn more about it. How, I mean, and I know you're a bit faithless in, seeing the world, really appropriate this new form of implementing and learning logic, but how do you go about, is it really difficult to expose this work in spaces that aren't necessarily mathematical or aren't scientific based? Like how is it really difficult to bring it into an art space and spaces like that, public spaces like that?
You mean this particular work or what we do in general?
What you guys do in general, especially like showing like Shea's toys, like
Right.
The flip stick logic and stuff. How do you convince non-mathematical space, or how do you, for example, how do you propose these ideas to be curated? How do you
Right.
convince?
Oh, I see what you're asking.
Yes.
Right, yeah. By the way, I liked your analogy that this is like getting under the hood. I like that a lot. I must remember that. But it's interesting the question you're asking, because you're proposing something that we took for granted ourselves that hasn't actually turned out to be so. You said, is it difficult to get this work into art spaces as opposed to science and science settings? Well, the funny thing is, when Chrissy and I started the Institute for Figuring, we believed that in as much as we would get invited to do exhibitions, that it would be in science museums and natural history museums, and that the art world wouldn't really pay us any mind. Maybe one day they would, but not for a very long time. And the reaction's been completely the opposite. From the beginning, the art world started inviting us to do shows, and the science world has, for the most part, utterly ignored us. So we do have the show of the Hyperbolic Crochet Coral Reef Project on at the Smithsonian at the moment, but that's after being 7 years. We've only ever had one other show in a science setting. All of our exhibitions, apart from that, have been in art gallery settings, which has been completely the opposite reaction to what we thought we got. And I'm still utterly mystified about why that is so. I mean, I've actually, because I'm a science communicator, and this is what I was doing it for, was to communicate about science and mathematics, I thought I'd be embraced. The science world says we need new methods of engaging the public with science. That's what our society needs. Well, here it is. And they've, in the 8 years of the Institute for Figuring's been funded, we've got not one single dollar from any science foundation. All of our funding has come through arts foundations. Almost all of our exhibitions have been in art settings. Almost all of our press has been in art settings. There's been almost no scientific reaction, support of any kind whatsoever. And I think this is a really interesting statement. And one of the things I'd like to say about it is that I think the art world is immensely open and generous and open to new ideas in a way that it shocks me that at the core of my being to say the science world isn't. And it's been a huge metaphysical crisis for me to deal with that fact. So we don't have a problem getting art curators interested. We do have a problem getting science curators interested. And now I say, love the one you're with.
Thank you.
It's a follow-up essentially to that question, which is when I go to the Museum of Jurassic Technology and I see a work like this, oftentimes I don't look at it in the same way that I would look at it in a science museum. I would think, what is this? Who made this? Was it the people who work in the museum who created this identity of this person who made this thing?
Can I just
Yeah.
say one thing in response to that, David? We believe we've done the Museum of Jurassic Technology an unbelievable service because we actually had the octogenarian genius lunatic in the building. He actually exists. Whereas most of the Museum of Jurassic Technology, it's not entirely true. The octogenarian, they're always just dying as the show opens. So
I guess like that's bringing it like what I would say is okay. Let me ask you a question. Is this man? Did he live?
he lives now.
He lives now.
He's very old.
And he created all this work.
Yes.
Okay. So then when you bring this kind of sort of factual-based material into a space where there's a lot of nebula floating around, is that a problem space for you trying to convey scientific material? I mean, or is that actually welcome in this kind
For
of...
me personally,
Yeah.
I love the Museum of Jurassic
No,
Technology.
I mean more for the material or how like the viewer might
right.
interpret this material.
I think Shea was personally, it was a little bit confronting for him, but he came very quickly to really appreciate it because nobody else is showing it. It sat in his basement for 50 years. Nobody's seen it. Nobody at all. My sister Christine is one of the very few people in the world who has spent any time understanding what the guy has done. And if it hadn't been for her, it probably would have sat in a basement forever. Or actually what will end it, when Shea passes away, which he could do any minute. He's very elderly now, he's very frail, he's not going to be with us much longer. What will happen to his work? And who knows? I mean, we would dearly love to give it a permanent home and have it. I mean, I think it's an amazing body of work that should be accessible to teachers and students and artists and scientists and logicians as a hugely inspiring thing. But we don't know what's going to happen. And I think Shea would have loved it if it had been, in the Science Museum or a Mathematics Museum. But hey, no one else was giving him the opportunity. So no, it was.
I guess I'm saying, do you think it confuses it? Can it confuse the work?
Well,
Complicate it.
but then you ask the question. I totally see that is a valid question. But the interesting thing is with the Museum of Jurassic Technology, there's a lot of things in the museum that are true that people think are made up. Now, I mean, it is. So the question is, who gets to decide? And in the context of this work, it is a real person. He did do it all. There are other things in the museum for whom that's true, and the great example in the museum that is indisputable is Athanasius Kircher, which is Kircher is the 18th century scientist who had the theories about building the towers to the moon and why that would cause the Earth to fall over. But I mean, Kircher was a real important 16th century, very important scientist in the 16th century when science was still in the process of formation. So that's one concrete example where the museum is presenting the body of work of an actual individual very, very, very faithfully. And so Shea is in that too. that category too. There are other people in the Museum of Jurassic Technology where it's hard to know whether the person was a real person or David made them all up. So I totally understand why you're asking, is it problematic for Shea? But as I say, nobody else was giving him any airing, and we think it's better that he has an airing than complete ignoral.
I'm not going to ask you a question, but I think we need to
Oh,
go into
yeah.
the more informal session. So anyone who has a question for Margaret can come upstairs and we'll take it from there. But thank you for this.
Thank you.